morning, everyone. I'm here with Gustavo. How are you, Gustavo?
Good morning, doing great, and you?
All good, all good. Back to back. We recorded yesterday and we record today again.
Yeah, big podcast week. Let's go there.
That's your future career. So Gustavo, since we continue to do our Brazilian or LatAm special, why don't you introduce our guest today, Benjamin Gleason?
Certainly, very excited to be here. So Benjamin is not only a friend, he's also a very well-renowned founder in Brazil. He participated head-on and first-hand in the fintech revolution. He was a Groupon member in the early innings of the Brazilian venture capital space. Then he founded Kamino after selling GuiaBolso to PicPay, and he's also a very active member in the Brazilian philanthropy and endeavor movement here. So Benjamin, very excited to have you here, and thank you for coming.
Thanks for the invite. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, you're probably a busy man, so thanks a ton for your time. Benjamin, to start, we usually start with some background on the both personal and professional lives of our guests. Uh, where did you grow up? What did you do in school? What did you do after school? How does a guy from Wisconsin end up in sunny Sao Paulo?
Yeah, that part, the weather definitely plays a factor. But yeah, I was born and raised in Wisconsin in Madison, and ended up going to study economics. And then actually, along the way, I had studied Spanish and got really into the culture and everything else. Ended up spending a year studying abroad in Chile along the way in the university. And before that, I spent a few months in Brazil. And honestly, I ended up liking Brazil a lot better than my time in Chile because the culture and Brazil's quite a bit warmer in general, right? On a lot of things. And so, kind of from that, I was able to pick up Portuguese as well. And my first job out of school was actually corporate finance consulting, and I hadn't studied finance or accounting. So they gave me, these two huge textbooks the first week and said, okay, read these, cover to cover, do all the problem sets. But essentially, they hired me because I spoke, the languages. So I started working out of Chicago, but then after doing some projects there, I ended up opening the Brazilian office here. So amazing experience. About 24 years old, opening an office here in São Paulo, and then basically Lula got elected the first time. All the American companies got scared, and so they decided to close the office here, and I ended up transferring over to Europe. So I was running biz dev in Europe for a few years, based out of Paris, and then went to Wharton to do my MBA. And I joke, it's actually true though, that there were actually more Brazilians at Wharton than there were people from like the Midwest of the United States where I was from. So only one from Wisconsin. So it was like a very different world, for me. But really, I went to do the MBA with the plan to go back to Brazil because I had enjoyed it so much, both personally and saw a lot of opportunity professionally. So I ended up after the MBA joining McKinsey here in Sao Paulo. Spent a few years at McKinsey, and then started the kind of entrepreneurial journey, which continues until now. One story which has been told a little bit, but not many people know, is that actually between McKinsey and starting to become an entrepreneur, I spent 3 months living in the largest slum in Rio, in Rocinha, and I
What?
helped
How
an
was that?
NGO do a turnaround project, like a
Why
volunteer
was that?
project. This was in 2010 in Rio. It was like I wanted a total break from the crazy like corporate pressure of McKinsey before I went in to do something else. And so it was like, a very interesting transition and able to have an impact with an NGO there. But it was before the so-called pacification of the favelas. And so it was quite intense, right? It was still controlled by the drug gangs. So a very different world from like McKinsey and corporate that I was used to.
And how was that experience?
I thought it was amazing because really, I ended up being much more exposed to how, a large percentage of the population in Brazil, ends up living, right? So it's much closer to like the reality than, kind of the bubble that we live in the business world. And also, Rocinha, because it's so big, it was incredibly developed, right? So despite being, basically a slum, it had, banks and with ATMs and supermarkets and restaurants and people working. And so it was interesting to see the level of commerce as well that was happening, within the local community, in addition to everyone going outside to work. So I think that actually, as I went forward, with GuiaBolso and everything else, which we can talk about, helped me to have like a little bit more perspective when people were talking about it. Okay, like, as they say in Brazil, like the A class, the B class, the C class, all the way down to the E class, having seen that kind of a little bit more firsthand.
Very interesting. And then you went to Groupon.
Yeah, and then I went to Groupon, and I think it was incredible because it had gotten this incredible, perfect product market fit. It was like the perfect, this kind of impulse buying, with you had 24 hours to buy, and so it really generated a lot of urgency in a moment that social media was really starting to explode in Brazil, and so you had people sharing, the offers via Facebook, for example. So it really grew incredibly fast, and so in the world at the time, they said that Groupon was the fastest growing company in the world. In Brazil, certainly was the fastest growing company, that had ever come to Brazil. In a few months, we were doing 20 million reais of revenue a month, which I think any startup to still now would be very happy with. But it was like really the start of kind of mass e-commerce in Brazil, because before that it had been limited largely to kind of the upper middle class, let's say, and this was a point when it actually came down and people were having access to broadband and mobile internet. They were having access to credit cards, and they were able to buy online, and that's what really unleashed Groupon. The flip side of that, I would say, which you'll probably ask about, but on the one hand, it was very execution driven, and so it was essentially the international expansion, which was 50 countries in a year, was done basically by the Saver brothers, the founders of Rocket Internet,
Hmm.
and so they were able to do this incredible global expansion with tons of execution, tons of like day to day in the trenches battling, to increase the numbers, but at the same time, very little in the way of technological, differentiation, very little in terms of thinking about, partnerships or other things which could make the product, more sticky or could create barriers to entry. And so in a sense, like as fast as Groupon, rose in a way, and it was, really insane. And we got a $6 billion acquisition offer from Google, and then ended up instead turning that down and IPOing for about $17 billion on Nasdaq, in a very very short time period with very little, even internal control systems, everything else. But just as quickly as that, kind of Groupon's model, really collapsed, and that was in part due to the fact that there were, even in Brazil, there were 1,500 copycats of the model, and so you had just this, very small to copy, and you ended up, the quality dropped, and the customer experience fell, and that really, made it a not very sustainable overall, longer term business model. And so that to me was really, I think that the two big takeaways as I, went to think about my next, my next challenge was, one, really, how do you create that differentiation? How do you, actually use technology? And I think the other was, how do you maybe find a space which is not quite as crowded? Like even having 1,500 copycats just of that model, not to mention the overall e-commerce boom that was happening. We just felt like, as I thought about my next step, e-commerce was just so saturated, and so we, went for something different, which, ended up being something very, very very different in the sense that there was nobody. So I'll
So
stop there and yeah, let you jump in.
So before going into the GuiaBolso story, we had Gonzalo here who worked with your Groupon and is your partner at Kamino. Yesterday we had Eric Asher, and he was commenting about the Peixe Urbano story. Also, we will have Julius Vasconcelos in the second semester. Would you tell us a little about this experience at Groupon? Because I mean, it was the epitome of product market fit. We all look at those charts, that how many months did XYZ technology take to reach a certain number of clients, and Groupon was amazing in that. How did that shape you? How did that mold you? What are your views on that now that you're older and more mature? Uh, um, how was that? I mean, it looks like an incredible journey. I'm sure when you were inside of it, it had its ups and downs.
Yeah, for sure. I think like from a practical kind of experience or skills perspective, I was leaving McKinsey, which is known for being highly analytical and really, able to structure a problem and to deliver a kind of a recommendation. Not as well known for execution. And this was pure execution. And so, I kind of joke like at McKinsey, we would look at like scenario A, B, C and study each one and do pros and cons and then choose one to start testing. And at Groupon, with the Rocket guys, it was like, okay, do A, B, and C all today, and then we know, and then we. So it's like,
A/B test in real life.
yeah. So really, from that perspective, incredible in terms of execution, in terms of being on this rocket ship, super exciting for sure. Like that, it's like in a way a drug, right? It's this incredible adrenaline rush, and you're just seeing like this thing just taking off and hiring people and just scrambling all the time. So, you know, it's kind of like people joke like, how do you know if you have market fit? It's like you know it when you see it. But if you've never felt it, then it's hard to, it's like elusive, right? So this was exciting because I was able to really feel this very, very intensely. The flip side of that is that it's crazy lifestyle. I did a summer in investment banking, which was the most hours that I'd ever worked in my life, and Groupon was basically that for a year. So just incredible hours, incredible pressure, incredible hiring and firing, and with people and those kind of issues. And so very, very, very challenging as well. And actually kind of looking forward to what I'm doing now with Kamino. One of the big things is that I had always worked in corporate finance, and in addition to being managing director of Groupon, I got the honor of being CFO of Groupon Brasil, and then CFO of Groupon, all of LatAm, including Brazil. And we had very, very few systems, so mostly done in Excel with millions and millions of lines of sales. um, but even more than that, I really saw firsthand like what does a finance department do, and it's in that kind of setting like 95% financial operations, and so you're doing accounts payable, accounts receivable, bank reconciliations. You have stacks of receipts and things on, we had those like stacked up on tables. Very, very little of actual corporate finance, because you're just like trying to keep the machine moving. And so that always, also was like, I think a good learning, it's like, what do you actually do in like in a controllership of a financial area, but also, I think more importantly, seeing the challenge of that if you're in a fast growing company and you don't have kind of the systems and the processes and really, the kind of the know-how in place. And so that's something, that we'll talk about later, but with Kamino, we're trying to really kind of give people that firsthand, as founders or as CFOs, so that they don't have to go through that same learning curve on what actually does the financial operations area do.
So that's why Kamino bought. Now I understand. Now I understand what you do.
I think
And
it's also
actually,
yeah.
yeah,
Go ahead.
the
Go ahead.
first hire in the finance department was a friend from McKinsey who is also in corporate finance, Guto, who is now a third co-founder with Gonzalo and I. So I quickly hired him and I said, okay, Guto, figure out what this is.
No, I was gonna say that one of the things that is also interesting about the Groupon story, not just in Brazil but globally, because at the time I don't remember when was Groupon first launched, maybe to mid 2010s, something like that,
Yeah,
around there.
yeah, 2010,
Because
yeah.
I guess that from a, I mean, from a global phenomenon, I mean, you obviously had social networks and stuff like that, especially around that time. But in terms of commerce, I remember. I mean, I was following the industry, the tech industry at the time from a journalist, from a journalism perspective, and I remember that as a global phenomenon in the commerce, in the internet e-commerce space, Groupon was, I mean, it was. I was gonna say killing it, but at least it was making a lot of noise in very different countries. So probably Brazil was one of the main examples of huge explosion. But even around Europe, it was all over the place. It was quick and it was fast, but it was all over the place, and it was a true like global internet phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah, and one, I think positive kind of aftermath of all of this, there are some criticisms of this kind of copycat model that Rocket was employing, but one really positive, I think, effect from all of this is that they actually created a whole generation of founders in especially in emerging markets, right, where you really hadn't had founders before. And so, often they were foreign founders, many German, but also from different countries that were all over the world. And so suddenly you had these like entrepreneurial people who had been actually not entrepreneurial at all. They've
Yeah.
been working at banks or consulting firms, and Rocky was able to convince them to join Groupon and other ventures. And then these people went on to found their own companies, and to this day, still many companies here in Brazil have founders and C-level that we know from the Groupon days, right? So I think that was really positive to accelerate as well. Kind of people leaving the safe seeming jobs like consulting and IB and really going to become entrepreneurs.
Great. And then you were one of them, of course. So then what led to GuiaBolso? What
Yes,
was GuiaBolso? Just so that
yeah, yeah.
our audience can explain.
Yeah, and actually, I'll quickly tell kind of the backstory, and that will say what we were really doing. But I had a good friend from I had worked with at McKinsey. He was still at McKinsey, but wanting to become to start to become an entrepreneur, Thiago Alvarez. And so Thiago and I started talking about okay, we want to do something. Groupon had just IPO'd as well, and after the IPO, like Sarbanes-Oxley, all the fun stuff that comes along with being a publicly listed company, I was ready to kind of leave that level of maturity and go back to more early stage. And I knew that I wanted to do something together with Thiago because we had great experience working together at McKinsey, and we
Had
kind of
already
looked at
become
it.
addicted
Yeah.
to the thrill. Okay.
Exactly, and for sure that's the case. We'll talk about that with Kamino, but in a sense, we looked at where do we see a huge problem that needs to be solved in a very large industry. We were very thinking a lot about how do we create positive social impact. What's an industry which perhaps is lacking in kind of people concerned about the consumers or about the end users. And ultimately, ended up really focusing in on the financial services industry, which was an industry that Thiago had already worked a lot in. And we kind of thought that there could be a tipping point happening because in Brazil, you had this phenomenon of for the first time, the emerging middle class having access to lots of credit, so credit cards and auto loans primarily, and then many of them going bust because they really didn't understand the products. The interest rates were among the highest in the world. The banks themselves didn't know how to underwrite these emerging consumers. And so we just saw a lot of inefficiency and particularly pain on the consumer side. And ultimately, we started out really focusing on the problem. So in a sense, how do we help consumers to better understand their own finances and, through understanding their finances, make better decisions around financial products and having access to better financial products because in Brazil, the products were among the most expensive in the world. So really ultimately not good for many consumers. So that was really the starting point. And one thing that we thought a lot about is from kind of the learnings from Groupon, how do we create these barriers to entry? How do we create really a solution which is going to be technological? But in the beginning, very much like hustlers, right? So we had an Excel spreadsheet. We were interviewing people about their budget, their finances, and the products that they were using, and putting it into Excel and trying to give people recommendations about how they could improve their personal finances that way. And what we ultimately ended up seeing is that people really don't know how to inform very well how much they actually make on a net basis after taxes, and much less how much they spend. So people, dramatically underestimate how much they're spending. They overestimate how much they make, and that leads to people, thinking they might have like a 10% savings at the end of the month. They're negative, and they don't know why. And we realized, we were kind of by asking people to inform the data, we were getting garbage in, garbage out. And we ultimately made a decision, basically bet the company after our seed round of completely pivoting towards, okay, we need to figure out a way to access this banking and financial data directly so that we can have a much better view of the true financial situation of our users, and then use that to give them much better recommendations. And so we went after trying to figure out the technology behind in a sense, with users' authorization, accessing their bank accounts and pulling in all of their banking data in order to organize that for them in a personal financial management application. And this had never been done before in Brazil. And this is, many years before, what became open banking and also the personal data privacy laws. And so at the time, there were still questions about who did the bank data actually belong to? Did it belong to the banks? Did it belong to the consumers? Could the consumers authorize, a third party to have access to this or not? Tons of questions there, and no fintechs in this space. We were pitching our story and putting fintech in quotes and then explaining what fintech meant. And so there were not a lot of references, or for that matter, there hadn't been fintech companies or really fintech exits in Brazil. So it was in the early innings in the U.S. and really nothing in Brazil yet. And so we were quite pioneer in that sense, especially on the accessing banking data and what has become open banking today.
And you think,
So,
do you think, Benjamin, you would have seen the opportunity, the GuiaBolso opportunity, as clear as you did if you had not spent 3 months in the favelas? Is there any relationship there?
Yeah, and we actually looked a lot at really the emerging consumers as kind of the first kind of customer demographic that we wanted to try to help. And Tiago had worked with that demographic as well on projects for banks when he was at McKinsey. And what we ultimately ended up finding is that because of this challenge of getting the kind of consistent data. What we needed actually was to connect to actual bank accounts. When we connected to actual bank accounts in the very early days, that pushed us a little bit up towards like more of a middle class, upper middle class demographic.
Because the lower class didn't have bank accounts, I guess.
They didn't have bank accounts, and they didn't have, in many cases, still kind of consistent internet and everything like that. And so that's been something which has been incredible to have really been on that, a part of that. So I'll make two comments, I guess, there. One is on the product market fit side. We were, as I said, we kind of pivot our focus completely to, okay, we're going to create bank aggregation technology to pull in the data. There was big questions about would consumers, authorize this? Would they give us their bank password or not? Would the technology even work? There was a huge question. In Brazil, it's quite difficult to access the bank accounts because of the security layers. And we were, launched on a web version first, and we're slowly, 10,000 users, 20,000 users. We're trying to get to 50,000 users for the year after our Series A with Kazakh. And we're on path, but it was going to be tough. And then we launched our first app, so our iPhone app, in July of that year, and we ended up getting to 50,000 users on the iPhone app in 2 weeks. And we actually became the number one app overall in the entire app stores, like ahead of WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram. So it was really, really incredible and quite unexpected. So that was, kind of the first sense of like, it's crazy, right? Product market fit, that like, why do Brazilians want to do, personal financial management more than like social media? And so we had really tapped into something because there were just no solutions, available, and it went, very quickly went viral by word of mouth. And so this was a sense of like, okay, the entire trajectory changed. We're now an app company, and by the time that we launched our Android app towards the end of that year, is 2014. Already you were seeing a lot, more kind of emerging consumers getting access to smartphones, so having Android apps. And Nubank had just been starting, so you saw a lot of emerging consumers starting to get access to bank accounts as well. And kind of from that point, 2014 onward, we really rode this incredible wave of this combination of smartphone access in kind of a mass way in Brazil, combined with access to digital banking and to financial products online, which even now, if you compare it to the rest of LatAm, Brazil is far and away has higher penetration and higher usage, much kind of a more complete offering for all types of consumers. And so that was something which was really fascinating to kind of watch from the inside. There were also challenges of being so early and being a pioneer, but that was one that was really cool to see, kind of more from like an industry perspective.
So a lot of questions here. The first one about product market fit. So now, as a more experienced founder, now I'm gonna mix up with Kamino as well. After Groupon, then GuiaBolso with the Apple app and the Android app, and now with Kamino. How do you see the product market fit process? The process of discovering it, going after, pivoting.
Yeah, I think one thing that definitely we look at a lot now with Kamino is not just kind of pure product market fit in the sense of can I create a product which I can get into people's hands and which they talk about, and they there's like this viral loop. I think that's important, but we weren't charging anything for the Groupon app, right? So I think we had found a very unique distribution model at the time, which was via really smartphones and social media and kind of this word of mouth and digital marketing. That became a very crowded space later on as all the big banks started doing digital marketing and social media. Everyone started offering apps, so that distribution advantage kind of disappeared. It had been the same at Groupon, door-to-door sales, anybody could do it. So although Groupon was kind of the first to do it to restaurants, it was easy to copy afterward. And so now at Kamino, we're thinking a lot about not only product market fit, but also, how do we try to find kind of the right distribution channels in the early days, which will give us a distribution advantage, and then also the business model fit, right? So making sure that we're, already kind of from the very beginning offering a product which has a positive, gross margin, and so generating kind of value for the company as well from the early days. Because I think one thing which many companies and investors lost sight of in kind of this incredible boom in 2020 2021 was it's actually not that hard to get product market fit if you're just giving away money, right? So if you say, okay, take my credit card, I'll give you 5% cash back for everything, that's a no-brainer for a consumer, but for a company, that's just like lighting money on fire, right? So it kind of, I think the bar, we've raised the bar kind of with our experience and seeing obviously what's happened in 2022 and onward. But I think that's really important, right? So not only can you find a product which people want, but are they willing to pay for it? Which is a pretty important part of being eventually a business, right?
And in practice, how harder is that? Because it seems very hard. I mean, product market fit is in itself, it's already a very, very difficult discovery process. Then business market fit and then price market fit all together. Of course, you guys at Kamino are experienced founders, but it seems a lot of things to do. If you had gone back to Groupon and GuiaBolso, what would you have done differently, considering this way that you see things now?
Yeah, and I think it is hard if you're just like growing like crazy and there's a lot of pressure to keep growing and everyone's growing. It's hard to kind of say, okay, I'm going to stop and really make sure that I have my business model fit before I start to accelerate. So I do understand kind of how people got caught up in this in 2021. I think at Groupon that what was missing was to kind of stop and say, okay, how do we actually create some technology? How do we create some differentiating factors as we continue to execute on the pure sales, to be more defensible model. GuiaBolso definitely looking back, I think we were fortunate in the sense that we had such an incredible user adoption curve and millions of users. So like every year adding 1 million plus users. We were able to be pretty successful at fundraising, based large on the kind of that product market fit, and so we didn't have as much pressure early on to really generate revenue. And looking back, that's something I would have probably started sooner, to already have done a lot more testing around that, to have created a culture as well within the company around we need to be a sustainable business model, we need to generate revenue, and so I do think that is important. And sometimes, if depending on what the product is, it might be too hard to do all of these, kind of different fits at once. But I think you do need to have a plan for that. You do need to be testing and to be, spending your brain power on, as the team is executing. Somebody, the founder typically needs to be thinking about, okay, how do I actually, make this a product, very quickly with positive unit economics. But definitely with at Kamino, because everything kind of flipped in 2022 and the focus went back to unit economics and positive contribution margin, and people weren't just growing to grow and lighting money on fire anymore. That was an advantage for our profile, I think, right? So we were able to then kind of not be the only ones talking about finding really truly business model fit before really accelerating. And I think that's been really good for us. So now as we're accelerating, we're really seeing kind of the whole model coming together, and that gives us a lot more confidence that we'll be able to keep growing this thing.
So you also have like a market timing, a market timing fit.
Yeah.
Makes it easier for
need
founders.
to adapt to
Very
to
easy.
market conditions.
So I want to get the segue that you mentioned about fundraising. You were a very successful fundraiser, of course, not only in GuiaBolso, but also in Kamino. You raised an immense and an incredible round. We have some founders in the audience, and So how do you see the process for that? How was the formation of your relationship with VC funds? How did you do that? How did you position yourself in the VC market so as to attract such a good roster of investors? And within that, how was the process of selecting which VC funds you wanted and which ones you didn't want?
Yeah, and I'll speak to my experience at GuiaBolso because I think that's closer. We were first time founders. We didn't have the relationships. We didn't have really the startup track record at all. So incredibly challenging. The way that we thought about it initially was we wanted to start out bootstrapping the business so that we could actually look for the product market fit before we really went aggressively kind of raising money and starting to deploy that money. And is this too loud? Sorry
It's
about
okay.
this.
It's okay.
No.
Let me.
We'll get rid of it. Don't worry.
Okay. If it's not too loud, otherwise I'll tell them to knock it off. There, I think they're doing something on the roof here. Sorry about that. But yeah, so I would say that in the beginning it was really hard because in Brazil there really weren't any early angel investors or kind of early stage VCs almost at all. So you got a handful like Kazakh and Monashis, but really not to anywhere close to what you have today. And so I think the challenge for that was one, you had after just a few conversations you were pretty much done. You had talked to the entire market, so you had a very small window seed round. Either you got it or you didn't, essentially, and you didn't have like
Can you imagine
experienced
the
founders.
pressure of those conversations?
Yeah, it's like and there weren't repeat founders to give you the tips because everyone was kind of the first generation founders, and so this was really really challenging. And I think ultimately, as we kind of went through the process and had these conversations, we started to really see that some investors really were able to add a lot of value and say really intelligent things about the business. Some of them even before they invested. So we had one investor who kind of told us twice like it won't work. You guys are going the wrong direction. Like you should look at this. And then twice we figured out he was actually right, and we're like, oh, okay, this guy could be a good investor for us. And so I think you start to see, which investors are the ones that are able to help you really, with insights or to help you, very concretely with the business. And I would say that our seed round was by far the hardest round to raise with GuiaBolso. The Series A was the next hardest round. The Series B was the next hardest round. So it kind of got easier with time. I think partly because of our experience and partly because the whole ecosystem was maturing and capital was coming in. But we ended up, several times taking lower term sheets from investors that we thought were kind of the right investor for the next step of the business. And that's something that I really encourage, startup founders to think about, because in a sense, especially in the early days, you're really trying to get a, to work towards a positive outcome, right? Like you're trying to avoid not finding product market fit and having to close down the business in 2 years, right? And so you really need to think about what investors are going to maximize your chance of finding that product market fit of really being, surviving as a startup, as opposed to the highest valuation, right? If you have the highest valuation and you close the doors in 2 years, it's not going to do any good. And so I think that's, really, really important. And the other thing are the kind of the relationships that you develop and, with some investors that are more hands-on, kind of having kind of the trust on both sides, right? So we had investors such as QED and Flourish at GuiaBolso, who ended up also investing in Kamino, right? Because we had that relationship. They had worked with me before. I really respected both of them and saw the kind of complementary value that they were able to add to businesses. And so I also wanted them back on our cap table, and that's a really cool dynamic that you can get. And even if you're not repeating as a founder, it's the same thing. For example, on the next round, people are going to want to see, are your existing investors going to continue investing? Are they going to take their pro rata? So it is important to have that kind of relationship and the trust there, so that you have these positive signals of investors coming back. And the last thing I would say, which I always tell early stage founders is, before you have any VCs as that kind of signaling effect, what I would look to for somebody starting out with a PowerPoint is your ex-boss going to invest, as an angel in your business? Is someone who really knows the industry going to invest, in your business? Because otherwise it's very hard, right? I don't have, if it's a founder who I don't know yet, an industry which I'm not as familiar with, it's very hard for me to look at a PowerPoint and say, okay, this is the right team, this is the right, business model. So really think about those signals, from within, kind of the universe that you have the contacts to. And for early stage, startup founders, often that's professional, contacts they've worked with before, and then really, hitting the concrete and seeking out people that understand the industry and getting those, people wanting to back you. I think that's, an incredibly powerful signal that then, seed VCs will look for.
And how would you say that evolved over time? The terms, the term sheets, the process, and the valuations. I mean, from GuiaBolso seed to Kamino seed. And
Yeah, I think two big factors. One is that the amount of venture capital funding available increased dramatically. So one, there's a lot more seed funds, which is great in LatAm, but then also you have the seed or the stage financing. So in the past, there really wasn't, there weren't growth funds available. Now there are. So I think that's very helpful. That's kind of the key to sustaining the venture model. And the other thing is that now there are startup founders who have been successful, who are wanting to give back to the community, who are doing angel investing, who are doing mentoring, and that's really incredible, right? So this is something we didn't have so much available, in terms of local founders here at the time. We then, as we went with GuiaBolso, we were able to access a lot of really incredible, kind of fintech founders outside of Brazil, including, we got to know the founder of Credit Karma, which he became kind of a mentor. Then Credit Karma actually invested in GuiaBolso, and Credit Karma was kind of the unicorn, fintech unicorn at the time, and really a benchmark for us. So that was incredible. And now you actually do have founders, locally, who have kind of been there, done that, and are happy to help. So I think that is really incredible, because we just didn't have any references on how do you fundraise, how do you look at a term on a term sheet and understand, is this fair? What can you negotiate? All of that stuff was really, just trying to kind of figure it out as we went. And nowadays you have people that can really give you very precise answers and guidance.
good, good. So going back now, and we're going to go to the business angel practice later. But going back, so you started GuiaBolso, and then the fintech revolution came up. I mean, everybody knows the LatAm fintech revolution, how it went down in Brazil, but this was before that. This was the very early innings. The Brazilian central bank was not looking into regulation. Creditas and Nubank were also being born altogether. What happened then?
Yeah, this was interesting because at the time there were seven big banks in 2012 when we started. There were seven big banks in Brazil, and the sense was that the kind of key advantage was the branch network of the banks, and so the more physical bank locations that you had around the country, the more successful you would be. And even after we started, it went from seven big banks down to just five big banks, as there was even more consolidation. And the sense was really that one, the central bank supported this type of consolidation, and two, that really you needed that branch network. And so even when we pitched many investors in the early days, they were like, "Why would we invest in you? You don't have any branches, right?" So this is like, there's no way you can make this work. And what we saw happen is that on the kind of market side, especially there was a bank teller strike in Brazil, and that all the bank branches were closed, and the bank kind of union really dug in, and so the branches stayed closed, I think, for like 6 months. And so that basically forced everyone to download apps and to figure out ways to do banking without accessing the branches. And so
Fantastic.
yeah, that was like, ironically, I think that was a
Let me ask
terrible
you.
thing for the
Let me
bank
ask you one
union.
thing.
So
The two examples that we mentioned, you are an American, Sergio from Creditas is a Spaniard, and
yeah.
David from Nubank is a Colombian. Would a Brazilian have founded a fintech in Brazil at that time, or would it take a foreigner to do that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, definitely people were skeptical, right? That the big banks could be, somehow challenged. And so, Tiago, my co-founder, was, always kind of trained to look outside, look for benchmarks in other places in the world, and understand how that, might kind of foresee the future of what could happen in Brazil. So I think he was a little bit unique. But as we were starting in the early days, actually, we got to one early founder who had been closed down by the central bank, and then they went after him criminally, personally. And he was a Brazilian, right? And so that was like, and many people told us like, oh, you should go talk to him. You should go talk to him before you do anything. So we were actually afraid that the central bank could try to close this down in the early days because they, didn't understand the model, or they didn't support the model. They wanted just stability with, consolidation of big banks. And so I do think that that was one where maybe being naive in a way, like I didn't kind of realize the power of the central bank here. Maybe that was helpful. But as we started to get traction and we saw, kind of these questions from the central bank, we started getting pressure from the big banks wanting to, try to shut us down or question our model. One of the examples we looked to were companies that were starting to really go big, like Uber, where their riders were actually helping to support them when they were, getting closed down by municipalities or different countries. So we thought a lot about that as having, if we could get to millions of users, and the millions of users really, supported GuiaBolso and showed that we were creating a positive impact in their lives, that would be very powerful, for the central bank to see, and for the, to put pressure in a way on the big banks as they were trying to do different things to limit us. And indeed, that was the case. So, including, we ended up being sued by one of the largest banks here, by Bradesco. And one of the things that they, alleged is that, somehow, we weren't serving the consumers' interests. We were taking their data, and some other, allegations that they made. And the judge, as they were asking to shut us down, right, to ask for an injunction, the judge, did a quick Google search, and he actually wrote in his opinion saying, basically, okay, I quickly looked. It seems like millions of people are being helped by this solution. Clearly, this is not called harm, right? So that was really, really, cool to see. On, if you're kind of doing the right thing and really focusing on the positive impact, how much that can really, kind of give you some protection against the incumbents who may, want to be questioning the model. And I think, obviously Nubank and others went through different challenges along the way. And perhaps the most unexpected and really amazing thing that happened from all of this is that the central bank went from really focusing on stability of the financial system, which meant kind of supporting consolidation, to almost exactly the opposite, in the sense of supporting innovation, supporting competition, supporting transparency, and really now driving a lot of the incredible innovation happening in fintech in Brazil, including the open banking regulation and entire framework, which is now a benchmark for the entire world. Also launching PIX, so the instant payment system, which is also a benchmark in the world. There, the central bank is actually helping consult with the U.S. Fed about the Fed finally trying to figure out instant payments. So totally unexpected and really amazing that they're playing such a protagonist role on what we would support as being positive, which is really the innovation and giving more options to consumers.
That's super good to see about the central bank. It doesn't happen very often, at least.
Fingers crossed so they can continue for a long time here.
And in
especially in
the
Brazil.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And in the process, so I was thinking now, Benjamin. So with GuiaBolso mostly catering to consumers, with Kamino now catering to B2B. Is there any thought process behind that transition, or is it just like seeing firsthand the opportunity that was also underserved by banks, as you said at the beginning, and let's go get it? There's a market timing, as I guess, as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, from a more of like the macro perspective that you mentioned,
And also, if you can
certainly,
explain exactly what Camino is, I think that
yeah.
would be useful.
I think what we saw we follow closely the U.S. Fintech evolution, which is kind of really the probably the fastest and kind of most diverse. And actually, it was interesting because we were able to access a ton of the top B2C fintechs, and that was the first wave. We talked to VCs, and the VCs were like, "Oh, we love Credit Karma, which is a really amazing company, but also we love Lending Club, which ended up having a lot of challenges after that." And there was a B2B company, an infrastructure company called Plaid, which nobody was that interested in, and they were not, sexy at all back in 2014. And as the market matured and you had all these B2C companies, the infrastructure opportunity grew, and suddenly Plaid became this massively important company that it is today. So I think that that was one thing which was really interesting to see for us on the U.S. side, that it went from kind of B2C to B2B to infrastructure, and within Brazil as well. What we see is that if everyone's doing B2C fintech, the acquisition costs get very, very high because everyone's going through the same channels. So your CAC goes up as everyone is giving these great new offers. You're getting competition for customers, and so your LTV is going down, and so the unit economics change dramatically when everyone's doing the same thing. And so we think a lot about distribution channels, and how do we find ways which we'll be able to really kind of be differentiated and not have everyone doing the same thing. And then once you get to a critical mass, you have infrastructure companies which can support all of these B2C and B2B fintechs. So on a kind of a macro level, that's how we think about it. From the perspective of really Kamino and seeing that opportunity, it had a lot to do from my side with how I had suffered as a CFO at Groupon and then at GuiaBolso, and all the challenges I had because there were no systems available to us, and really I just didn't find within the market the right financial products for our fast growing company. I didn't find kind of the ERP and other financial management tools that you now have on the B2C side. And so we saw that there was really a gap there still, particularly in emerging markets. And ultimately, I think the personal motivation was more around, I want to solve this for other entrepreneurs and people I'm mentoring and people I'm investing in, so that they don't have to go kind of through all this pain that they're still going through, despite the evolution of the overall ecosystem and so much more capital available. And then also, seeing that if we can kind of unleash the founders to focus on their actual business and not on a lot of this kind of back office financial management and trying to run after and figure out how to open, bank accounts and use credit cards and things, that will have a massive impact, because these are the fastest growing companies, the ones that generate the most new GDP and the most new jobs. And so there's a massive systemic impact. And so what ultimately Kamino is doing is we have a financial planning and spend management platform. So it's both a software to help companies automate all of their financial operations, as well as to be able to get a lot more financial insights out of what their business is doing, so understand their business better, generate the metrics, take better decisions, do better investment reporting in terms of the startups. And then within that, we have embedded payments. So we're also offering to startups and even non-venture backed, any fast growing company these days in Brazil, bank accounts and credit cards embedded within the overall software. And so companies can do all the financial management across all of their different bank accounts and their credit cards within a single platform. And they can also use our rails, which are really optimized for this type of business. And so I think we did find a gap in the market. There are now more fintechs than there had been certainly when I started GuiaBolso. So there are some good point solutions for different things which have emerged, which is great for the ecosystem. But I still think there's a lot of fragmentation and really not kind of one or two providers that are able to kind of package a number of solutions within a single experience, a single point of contact. And really that's what Kamino is ultimately going for, is being this platform with proprietary tools, as well as embedding different partners in that platform to be kind of this single point of contact, single point of reference for finance departments and founders.
And how much easier was it to do all these integrations for Camino against doing all the required integrations for GuiaBolso 6 years ago?
Yeah, dramatically easier, because you do now have much more the ecosystem and the infrastructure. Back in the day, we were struggling just to even get a bank account opened, and we had to get referred to a bank manager who finally agreed to open just a local bank account for us. Spent tons of time on this. We spent tons of time at the notary public just to get the company opened. And so there's just tons of really basic inefficiency at the time, and nowadays. I think even the incumbents have gotten a little bit better, a little bit more digital, and then there's a lot more kind of fintech plays that have come in. So we've benefited from a lot of different things to already kind of plug and play in a sense, and so that's been super important for us to be able to have, for example, bank partners or legal partners and things like that we can plug into a centralized digital platform. In the past, the banks didn't even have any APIs. They didn't really trust digital. They want everything in paper, and so they wouldn't even have agreed to partner with us. Whereas now, the tune is very different. So I think there's been a mindset change by some of the more traditional incumbents and then also certainly an acceleration of the underlying architecture, which is available for companies who are just getting started, and kind of Kamino also playing a part in that financial infrastructure layer for on the B2B side for fast growing companies.
And one curious question: when you talk to the Credit Karma guy who became your mentor, you just said, how did that evolve in the U.S.? Because the Brazilian
Yeah,
central bank was a big foster of this revolution here.
yeah. For him, there was actually a lot more infrastructure available. So we were always, shocked by that, because he kind of told the story of, a little bit joking. So I don't think it was quite this fast, but in a sense, he kind of said, okay, I had the idea for Credit Karma. So kind of day one, I went to the credit bureaus and I was able to get a deal with the credit bureau to offer people, to show people their credit scores for free online, which is a huge kind of revolution in the U.S. at the time. Credit scores had always been charged for and were hard to access. But he was able to strike a deal with the credit bureau to be able to, have kind of his most expensive, or his, kind of key user proposition available. And then the next day he said, I plugged into an affiliate network to sell credit card leads. And by day three, I had revenue. So, here, the
A little
paradigm.
different, a little different.
Yeah,
Just
exactly. We're like, okay, so we, bet the entire company building financial, bank data aggregation technology in order to access the data. And then, we spent years actually proving out online lending as a model using this banking data, and then convincing bank partners to come on board and to trust, our credit score and our underwriting. So it was, years in the making for all these different pieces to, really start to generate the marketplace and the revenue. And so I think, that was just always so shocking for us. And, nowadays, kind of some of our references for Kamino, if you look at, Brex and Mercury and Ramp, you have all these, fintech players in the US that, really are almost like, kind of, even like Stripe Atlas, it's almost like startup in a box, right? So you can start in just a few days. You already have your company established. You have your bank account. You can collect payments. You can make payments online. We're still a ways away from that in Brazil and in LatAm, even more so. And so still a lot of opportunity, I think, to kind of get closer to what we're seeing in the US, despite, as we mentioned before, kind of some of the upheaval now with Silicon Valley Bank and other things that have happened there.
And even with all that, after selling GuiaBolso to PicPay, having the opportunity to become an executive, you chose to found another company in Brazil and to become a business angel in Brazil.
Yeah, wasn't planned at all. I had a sense that I was going to take a long time off before I ever founded anything else.
Did you
So
take any time off?
no, I took about
No.
a week off.
Okay.
uh, it was very unplanned. I think there was a piece of it which is kind of opportunistic. Of, I had been talking with my friends Gonzalo and Guto, so two guys who I worked closely with at Groupon. We had seen that we worked, well together, and they had become good friends, in the past 10 years. And so talking to them a lot about, the kind of the frictions that we were seeing, on the finance side for startups and fast growing companies. And, all of us, they particularly were wanting to, do something entrepreneurial again. I was thinking about being more of like an advisor for them or something to have some time, off, or figure out next steps. But ultimately, once they said, okay, we're doing this, this is going, and I thought it was an interesting kind of market window that we had a good chance to try to solve this problem in a really scalable way. And I was getting tons of requests for mentorship and for, by angel investments I had made to help them set up the company and help them figure out how to get bank accounts and help them figure out how to do, set up the finance areas of their companies as they were growing. I felt like, rather than doing this a ton of one-off conversations, it would be interesting to kind of do this in a scalable way. And with Kamino, and the other thing I joke with some other kind of repeat entrepreneurs, it is like a drug, right? The adrenaline and the the stress of it all. It's like you do miss that once you kind of step out of it. And so I think there's a piece of me which wanted to kind of jump back in and keep going on this. So we'll see. So far, so good. But it is, exciting, and as you're going for the product market fit and everything else, I think it's just really cool to see. Okay, there's definitely a problem. What's the solution? How do we figure this out? How do we iterate through this? It's something that I enjoy a lot. Which maybe I enjoy that more than having 200 employees and being a much more mature kind of scale up. So I think there is something to be said about the stage, and the stage which really kind of gets you excited and wanting to keep pushing, which is kind of where we're at now with Kamino.
And from a personal perspective, how different it is to found the next company, the second one.
Yeah, I think definitely it for sure is a lot easier. Not to say that it's easy by any stretch, but on the fundraising side, because of kind of the track record and the existing relationships, we essentially did about a 2-week fundraise, and we're massively oversubscribed, even after doubling the amount that we ended up deciding to raise. And so that was helpful. Also, when we were starting, GuiaBolso, we had almost no network to hire people, to get to advisors, to get to partners. Now it's much easier because we're kind of plugged into this ecosystem. And also, it's remarkable how much the talent has changed in terms of experience. And so, someone was asking us, what was kind of your first growth strategy at GuiaBolso? And I was remembering back to the early days. We actually hired a university intern to be our growth guy, and he had no idea what he was doing, but he's a smart kid, and we were like, okay, we can try to train him. We're figuring this out too. Whereas now we're hiring people that in the past would have gone into consulting or banking, but now are actually coming to us 24 years old, who used to work at Uber, or used to work at iFood, or used to work already in the startup environment. So they come very, very smart people who have already been through this. They understand the kind of the culture and the hustle that startups take, and so that's really cool. It's a huge advantage to have people. If your growth strategy, you can hire someone who's actually driven a growth strategy before, which really accelerates things, and it means that as kind of a founder, you don't have to be as involved in every single detail, which is nice, right? So you can focus on things, kind of the next challenge, as opposed to just the pure execution on a day-to-day basis. And the last thing I would say is, from kind of people management and just, understanding the stresses of a startup, I think, you're able to get a longer term perspective. You're able to kind of see what worked on the people side and what didn't, and what you might do different. And so already, kind of make some adjustments to the way that you think about building the culture, and really, executing kind of the people side of the business as well.
And as an angel, Benjamin, do you mostly stick to what you know, so financial services and those types of sectors, or do you also like invest in stuff that you don't know? And I'm mostly asking these because I've seen through the years we've seen. I mean, you can categorize business angels in many different ways, but there's like this type of business angel who knows a lot about an industry. So when he talks to entrepreneurs building something new, I mean, most of the times you try to see the negative. You end up seeing the negative things instead of the positive things. And we actually have like a colleague of ours at KFund who's a very active business angel, and he knows, for example, a lot about developer tools. And I was just having this chat with him the other day, and he says, "I'll try to stay away from developer tools because I've had too much of that." What are you mostly focused on as an angel?
Yeah, I think that's been a little bit of a learning experience as well. I used to go much broader, and so if someone told me, "Hey, this is a great founder, you should talk to him," they're doing something really interesting, and it's in like one that we ended up doing was kind of a LinkedIn 2.0, base kind of in the U.S., trying to launch into LatAm, not into Brazil. So that type of thing, and now really I've focused a lot more because I just I can't add that much value to a completely different industry, different country. Go to market is all different, and so I've definitely restricted a lot more. And so in terms of really domain knowledge, it does end up being fintech, where I'm more comfortable. I stay away from crypto and DeFi, which are things which I don't understand as well. I just haven't had the time to really dig into it. But I would agree on the point of like when people come to me like, oh, I'm going to build GuiaBolso 2.0, I'm like, don't do it. Like you need to do something new. So definitely like people wanting to build kind of the same thing. That I'm more skeptical about, but I do believe that there are really interesting opportunities still in fintech, and I understand more about the distribution advantages and things like that. And then the other thing that I do spend time on, I am still investing in outside of fintech are either kind of former employees of GuiaBolso, which have gone on to become entrepreneurs, and then also underrepresented founders, and so women and people who are minorities of different types. I do spend a lot of time mentoring and making investments there. And one thing which has been cool is that actually a lot of ex GuiaBolso, managers and leaders happen to be women who then became entrepreneurs, who I was then able to angel invest in. So there's a nice overlap as well of people that I've worked with in the past who are great, women founders. So those are really kind of the two areas that I'm focusing on more today. And time is a challenge, capital is a challenge, and so I'm not a hugely proficient angel. But the other thing I figured out is that if you do 4 or 5 investments a year for 8 years, you end up having a lot of investments. It turns out, so kind of even without trying, you just start to accumulate, and then suddenly you have this portfolio, which is cool, right? Because it's always awesome to interact with all the different founders, but there's a lot of bureaucracy involved as well on the tax side and everything else.
And in terms of geography, is it mostly Brazil, LatAm,
Mostly
US?
Brazil, yeah. I think one is I think I have a better insight into the country and helping founders to think about go to market in Brazil, but also I have better deal flow and access to kind of better founders and better investments naturally from being kind of part of the ecosystem here. So it is something that I tend to prioritize.
But apart from the access, how do you see the LatAm opportunity after all that? I mean, and you have a very good vision through Kamino as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly Mexico, seems to be following Brazil a few years behind and maybe has had a few additional challenges, but I think there is, massive, massive potential in Mexico and then Colombia and kind of across the different countries, with some lag to Brazil. So having seen what worked in Brazil, I do think is an advantage in terms of how other, ecosystems might adapt. And so I do think we're still in the early innings for sure on the other kind of ex Brazil LatAm opportunities, which I'm very excited about. I also think that people have started to understand better the challenge of either leaving Brazil to go to Mexico or vice versa. It's not easy at all. It's not just about hiring one country manager and then hoping that's going to work. It's significantly more difficult, especially coming into Brazil. But I do think that founders are kind of figuring out how to you know understand the challenge better and to really take that seriously and kind of build the necessary infrastructure. There's still not very many good examples that have been really successful in kind of making that expansion, but I think that will come with time. Actually, that was an interesting one where I kind of missed from knowing too much. I was talking to a friend of mine back in the day, and he wanted to launch the business in Mexico and in LatAm, and then take it to Brazil. And he said, "Okay, I'm going to hire one country manager, but I'll have you as an advisor. So probably that's enough to launch in Brazil." And I was like, he has no idea what he's talking about. Passing, and that turned out to be Allscar with Corner Shop. So that was a very bad pass.
Oh,
Um, they never were really successful
expensive
in
one.
Brazil, and they still built a great business. So, in retrospect, I should have recognized that.
Amazing one. So, in the interest of time, I just have two other questions. The first one is to go into your philanthropy effort. You're a very active person in Endeavor, and a very well known person for mentoring young entrepreneurs. Um, would you want to comment a little about that? How do you see that? How do you dedicate your time? Has that fueled you as a person over the last years?
Yeah, I think this is something which is really important to me, and I do think that from the early days, with GuiaBolso, as we're starting, we're thinking a lot about social impact. I tend to have a view on how can you be really scalable in social impact, and so no offense to people that go and like paint walls at a nursery or teach English or something to a kid, like that's great, but it's not very scalable, and so kind of what I realized is I believe that if you can help startup founders to be really successful at businesses that create impact, you're multiplying incredibly the amount of impact. And ultimately, the time that I need to invest in each one is very low because you have a very self-motivated founder who has a lot of personal incentive to make the business work. And so I have put more time kind of towards Endeavor and towards mentoring and angel investing into businesses that could if they're successful, these startups will have a lot of social impact. And I think Endeavor is a good filter because once entrepreneurs are part of the Endeavor network, there's been a filter around do they actually have kind of a viable business model on the one hand, and on the other hand is are these kind of people which have integrity, which have ethics, which have kind of like this kind of personal character bar, which Endeavor looks for, which is great. So I don't have to try to figure that filter out on my own for every opportunity. I'm able to kind of use the Endeavor infrastructure and filter for that. And it's it tends to be a great bunch of people. So being really involved in that, also being able to do, for example, like a mentorship about fundraising for 30 different entrepreneurs at once, on a single call with Endeavor, in terms of scaling, really the impact is really cool. And the last thing I would just say is, along the way, a lot of founders and a lot of people, ended up helping me out with no, personal incentive beyond just helping me. And I do think, the thing with Endeavor and giving back is super important, right? So, the people who help me, oftentimes I won't be able to help them, but I'll be able to help other people and they'll help other people. But actually, ironically, one just anecdote, I did a mentorship about fundraising for a great woman founder for Madi of Guppy. Several years ago, she was kind of in a hard fundraising decision and negotiation.
She became an amazing fundraiser. Congrats.
Uh, and so what was so ironic is I was able to help her out, back in the day. And then as we were starting to fundraise for Kamino, it was so different. Like pre-seed, people were like throwing term sheets at us in a way. And I was like, wow, this is so different. I've never been through this as a pre-seed, founder. So I actually reached out to her and she was able to give me mentorship about, okay, like, this is the current fundraising environment. So it's super cool, for something like that to happen. It's not something that I expect will happen, but it is, it's happened a number of times, and that's really amazing and incredible for the ecosystem that you can help people at some point, and they help you in the future. So even from like the kind of personal perspective, right? I think it's helpful, but also I felt many times when I was kind of stuck on a really hard problem at GuiaBolso and I couldn't figure out how to solve it, and oftentimes I was so stressed like I stopped doing mentorship for a while. What I actually found was, when I'm able to help somebody else for their business and they go off running and are able to figure things out, that actually gives me, a huge amount of adrenaline and kind of excitement about, helping other people. And that often translates back into the problem that I'm trying to solve and help me get through that and have kind of the energy to keep pushing forward. So I do think there, is an interesting dynamic there. And so I've, kind of managed to keep that up from that point on, or having a consistent, kind of this mentorship and ultimately also for Kamino, obviously it's helpful because we are really tied into the early stage startup community. We're helping a lot of founders, even though they're not customers yet, and they end up seeking us out in the future or recommending us as Kamino to other founders. And so I do think there's a positive, cycle for the business as well there.
Fantastic. This giving back angle is amazing. And my last question is, all this trajectory, um, how did it all shape you as a person? I mean, and all this, you had an immense success, of course, several challenges along the way, couldn't be otherwise, but in the end, it's a very very net positive story, to put it the least. How would you say that shaped you?
Yeah, I think one thing in terms of I was thinking about the decisions I made to start being an entrepreneur to go for different opportunities. It was based a lot on who the other founders were together with me, or the kind of my peers. And so I think that's been one thing which has been incredible. Is like you're going into battle, but you're going into battle with somebody that you trust, somebody that you really like, and that you want to spend years with in the trenches. So I think that's important for other founders if you're thinking about being a single founder or trying to form a team which looks complementary but it has never worked together. One thing which has given me a lot of kind of personal satisfaction is having these amazing partners like Thiago in the past, and now Gonzalo and Guto and Pereña. So that's one thing which I've really taken away as something which I think has been positive for me in general. The other thing, we talked about Brazil, but I think I felt like I want to continue to be a founder in Brazil as opposed to maybe going back to the US or something else, because the problems here are still so much bigger, and the white space is so much bigger than in really developed economies. And so I feel like I can have a much bigger impact here, be more differentiated, and it is my adopted country. My kids are Brazilian now, and so it's a country that I want to help to shape in a positive way. And the last thing I would say is, I kind of realized GuiaBolso was so intense and kind of all consuming that I really didn't have any hobbies left by the end. And so I decided, I needed to have like hobbies and find things for like positive fun and not just the ups and downs of the startup world. And that I needed to actually stick with it. And so if it was hard in the beginning, I needed to stick with it, just like with a startup. So I actually decided to learn to surf at my advanced age here. So horrible in the beginning, now semi confident, hopefully better in the future. But sticking with something and kind of saying, okay, I'm going to figure this out, and despite the ups and downs, make it happen, and it adds positively to my life. So we'll see. Hopefully, in a few years, I'll be able to tell stories about like getting real waves on your podcast here.
It's funny that you say that. I was born in '86, so I'm 36. I also started surfing like 7 months ago, and I actually posed like that question to myself several times, like, is it too late? Is it too late? And one of these days, I think it was last summer, I went into Reddit and I did the usual search. Is it too late to start surfing at 36? And I think the top response was something along the lines of, "You should have started yesterday. So go get the waves." So totally, it's never. I don't. I mean, it's probably easier when you're 15 or 20, but it's never too late. I think, and it's fun. It's fun. It's good
Yeah,
to clear your mind for sure.
for sure. Yeah. My first instructor was 19 and weighed about 20 kilos less than me. And I started surfing when he was 4. He was saying like, just feel the wave, just feel the wave and go. So then I was like, okay, I need an older instructor who like has actually learned this.
Yeah, but I think actually we're going in a different direction. But I think actually, I mean, sports that or any kind of hobby that force you to be disconnected from tech and stuff like that, especially for, I mean, probably you, Gustavo, myself, and all of the people, and most of the people listening to this podcast. So anything that you do that actually disconnects you from smartphones, technology, just be out in nature and nothing to do. Basically, it's you and the wave, or you and the mountains, and that kind of stuff. I think it's super positive, even if it's just like a few hours per week. I think it's
For
very
sure.
useful.
Yeah, I actually had tried during the pandemic to meditate, like sitting in a room with my eyes closed, and it made me more anxious. And I was like doing a to-do list in my head, and so definitely like the active meditation, right, which is surfing and things like that, and disconnecting, as you say, and having positive adrenaline, right, I think is also good because you have lots of negative adrenaline as a founder at different times. Yeah, so I've also decided now I'm trying to figure out rock climbing, which is a similar, nature, no cell phone, so yeah, those are great compared to like things which are you just can't unplug.
Totally. Benjamin, last two questions that we pose to all of our guests. Can you recommend us a book or some other kind of content? Can be startup related or not? And can you also recommend us someone to invite to the podcast that hasn't been on before?
Yes. So the book I always recommend, it's I think now pretty well known, but Hard Things About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. Still, I've gone back to read that at different times. So I've kind of read passages of it probably 10 times already. It really paints the non-glamorous life of a startup founder, which I think is important for people to realize. It's not like hearing David Velez speak about the incredible trajectory of Nubank, which seems completely linear and logical. Definitely the real journey is not like that, and so I think that's super valuable. The other
It's a
just kind of
biography of
source,
founders.
yeah, the
Yeah.
source who I love, who I just think is one of the smartest fintech minds out there, is Frank Rotman. So his
Hmm.
Twitter tweet storms are usually amazing, and very taking complex topics and kind of distilling it down. Um, so a founder who you could have. One who we mentioned today, I don't know if you've talked with her yet, but Mari from Guppy would be, I think, a great founder to think about. Another founder within the fintech world, Susie from Dini. So she has an amazing life story, and Dini is a Brazilian fintech here, which I think is doing really interesting things, and so I think those are both great examples of women entrepreneurs and who have interesting life stories and have been really successful on the business side.
Fantastic. So let's get them
Awesome.
both.
Benjamin, it's been a pleasure. So thanks a ton for your time.
Likewise, thank you for the invitation and great to chat with you guys.
See you soon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. See you soon.